For 20 years, one river belonged to a monster fish that would not stop breeding. It jumped from the water like a missile. It broke noses. It swallowed the food chain whole. Billions were spent to stop it. An ancient predator was raised from extinction to fight it. And then, without warning, it started vanishing. Nobody pulled the trigger. Nobody claimed the kill. Something else did this. And when scientists finally found out what, it wasn't a hero anyone was rooting for. Stay with this, because the answer is stranger than anything they could have written for a movie. There's a stretch of the Illinois River near Starved Rock where, for the better part of 2 decades, the water itself seemed to be made of fish. Drop a net into that current, and you wouldn't pull up a catch. You'd pull up a wall of silver, bodies packed so tight against each other that the net groaned under the weight before it ever broke the surface. Biologists who worked that stretch of river got used to a strange kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from finding too little, but from finding too much of the wrong thing, over and over, season after season, until the sight of a single healthy native fish flopping the boat became the surprise instead of the norm. They didn't say out loud, not for years, but every one of them privately wondered if this river was gone for good. Then, quietly, almost as if the river were holding its breath, the hulls started getting lighter. Not overnight, not in one clean before and after moment that anyone could point to and say, there, that's when it happened. It crept in slowly, the way a tide goes out without you noticing until you look down and the shoreline has changed. A few less fish this season, a few less the next, until crews who had spent years bracing for a boatload of thrashing carp found themselves staring instead at open water where the fish used to be. Nobody wanted to say it first, saying it felt like tempting something. But finally, on one of those survey boats, somebody said the thing everyone had been quietly noticing and quietly afraid to trust. The carp were leaving. And nobody, not one person on that crew, could say for certain why. That uncertainty is the whole story. Because when a threat that size disappears without an obvious cause, you don't just get relief. You get a question that won't leave you alone. What actually did this? To answer it, you have to go back, all the way back, to where this entire disaster started. Because the story of the Asian carp is really a story about how a good idea, handled carelessly, can slip out of human hands entirely and take on a life nobody planned for. In the early 1970s, aquaculture operations across the southern United States were dealing with a stubborn, expensive problem. Algae. Fish farms raising catfish in man-made ponds kept watching their water turn thick and green, choke with the kind of bloom that steals oxygen and makes it harder to raise healthy stock. The fix that farmers landed on had been used in Asia for generations. Stock the ponds with carp species that had been selectively bred for exactly this purpose. Silver carp and bighead carp are filter feeders. They swim with their mouths open, straining out the algae and plankton suspended in the water column, and in doing so they clean it. It's an elegant piece of biology, and inside the boundaries of a farm pond, it worked exactly as advertised. Nobody in those early years imagined they were making a decision that would haunt an entire region for the rest of the century. The trouble is that ponds flood, levees fail during heavy rain, water spills over containment structures, and when it does, whatever is living in that water goes wherever the flood takes it. Over the course of roughly a decade, small numbers of these carp slipped out of aquaculture facilities and into connected waterways of the American South, one flooded season at a time, one quiet escape after another, so gradual that no single person could be blamed and no single moment marked as the beginning of the end. From there, they didn't need any more help. The Mississippi River system is one enormous, interconnected plumbing network, and once carp reached it, distance was no longer a real barrier. Within about 10 years of the first documented escapes, silver and bighead carp were established and breeding in the Mississippi Basin. And breeding is where this stops being an inconvenience and starts becoming something closer to a takeover. Sit with this number for a second, because it's the number that explains everything that follows. A single female silver carp can release hundreds of thousands of eggs during one spawning season, and under favorable conditions that number can climb past 1 million. One fish, one season, over 1 million potential offspring. There's essentially nothing native to North American freshwater built to survive an invader that reproduces at anything close to that rate. The ecosystem simply had no defense prepared, because nothing in its long history had ever needed one. What made the silver carp especially destructive wasn't aggression, in the way we usually picture a predator. It never had to chase anything down or fight anything for its next meal. It did something quieter and, in its own way, far crueler. It went after the very bottom of the food chain, the plankton that every fish in the river depends on the moment it hatches. Picture a larval fish, days old, barely more than a sliver of tissue in a yolk sac, entirely dependent on that first microscopic meal to survive its opening weeks of life. Now, picture something arriving ahead of it every single time, stripping that food source clean before the native fry ever gets a bite. That is exactly what happened. Silver carp filter continuously, consuming volumes of plankton that dwarf anything the native ecosystem had to compete with. And when a river's base layer empties out, the whole structure above it starts to starve from the ground up. It didn't matter how tough or resourceful a native predator species was at the top of the chain. If the smaller fish it needed were dying of hunger before they ever reached adulthood, the predator had nothing left to inherit. Native forage fish, the species that catfish and bass and so much of the river's life depended on, began quietly disappearing. Not hunted, not eaten, just starved out from underneath, one generation at a time, until there was almost nothing left holding the middle of the food web together. By the height of the invasion, biological surveys in parts of central Illinois River were returning numbers that read like typos, the kind of figures a biologist double-checks before believing. In some stretches, carp made up the overwhelming majority of everything alive in the water. In certain reaches, more than two-thirds of all fish biomass by weight was Asian carp. Picture from the deck of a boat, net after net coming up carp, 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 and maybe, if the crew was lucky, one native fish flopping somewhere in the middle of that silver avalanche. This was a native river with an invasive problem anymore. This was an invaded river with a few natives still clinging on by their fingernails. And then there was the danger nobody warned you about until it happened to them. Silver carp jump. Startled by the vibration of a boat motor, a fish weighing well over 10 pounds will rocket itself several feet straight out of water, and when it startles an entire school at once, the river turns into something closer to a shooting gallery than a place to spend an afternoon. Boaters were hit in the chest, the face, the ribs. Wildlife agencies logged broken noses, black eyes, concussions, deep gashes from fins as sharp as knives. People were knocked unconscious in their own boats by a fish they never even saw coming. A river that families once used for recreation had, in places, become something people approach the way you'd approach a stretch of highway known for accidents. Necessary maybe, but never without a flicker of fear. And all of that would have stayed a serious but contained problem if the Illinois River had simply emptied out somewhere quiet. It doesn't. It flows north, straight toward the one place this invasion could never be allowed to reach. Over a century ago, engineers reversed the natural flow of the Chicago River and cut a channel connecting it directly into the Mississippi drainage system, erasing a natural divide that had kept two entire freshwater worlds apart for thousands of years. That door has stood open ever since, day and night, without pause, for more than 100 years, and now something was swimming toward it that had never existed on the other side. What waits on the other side of that door is not something you can afford to lose. Lake Michigan supplies drinking water to more than 40 million people. It carries a multi-billion-dollar fishery built on walleye, whitefish, lake trout, and salmon, an entire regional economy balanced on a food web that still, for now, functions the way the Illinois River's food web used to function before the carp arrived. If silver and bighead carp had ever gained a real foothold there, the consensus among scientists was blunt and frightening. There will be no undoing it. Not eventually, not with enough money or enough will. Once established in water that size, an invasion like this doesn't get reversed. That is the size of the fear that drove what happened next. Because the door couldn't simply be closed, it was a working shipping canal, moving barges and commerce every day. Engineers had to find a way to seal something that legally had to stay open. In the early 2000s, the Army Corps of Engineers sank an electric barrier into the canal bed roughly 36 miles from Lake Michigan, pumping a field of current to the water strong enough to turn back or stun any fish that tried to cross it. One barrier became several. They ran the current stronger. They built in redundancy, because there could never be a single day, not one, when that wall went dark. Even that wasn't considered enough. Near a choke point called Brandon Road, engineers layered on bubble curtains, underwater sound designed to repel carp, and lock flushing systems, an entire gauntlet stacked on top of the electricity, at a projected cost exceeding $1.5 billion, all of it aimed at stopping one species of fish from crossing one narrow stretch of water. And here's the sentence that should stop you cold. Despite all of it, the electricity, the bubbles, the sound cannons, the money, the carp kept breeding faster than any crew, any barrier, any budget could keep pace with. You can spend $1 billion building a wall. You cannot spend $1 billion stopping a single female fish from dropping 1 million eggs a year. The invasion kept outrunning every dollar thrown at it. So a different kind of idea began to take hold, one with a strange, almost irresistible logic to it. What if the answer wasn't machine at all? What if something already living in these waters, something the river itself had once relied on, could do the job for free. There was a candidate. A big one. The biggest one imaginable, actually buried in the history of these very waterways. Long before the canal, long before the carp, long before any of this, the rivers of the Midwest and South had a monster of their own. A native apex predator that could grow past 8 feet and 300 pounds, an armored, ancient dinosaur-era survivor with a long, toothy snout and scales a knife could barely cut through. The alligator gar. For millions of years it had ruled the top of this food chain, feared by everything smaller than it, which was nearly everything. And to a public terrified of losing its river, the math felt almost too clean to resist. Bring back the old monster to fight the new one. But there was a reason the gar wasn't already in that river doing exactly that job. There was a reason it had vanished from Illinois completely. And the story of how a 300-pound armored survivor of the dinosaurs got wiped off the map of an entire state is not really a story about the fish at all. It's a story about us, about the name we gave it, and what that name let us do. Trash fish. That's what people called it for generations, without a shred of guilt. Not a description of danger, not a warning. Just contempt, stamped onto a living animal by people who had decided it had no value. Fishermen shot them in the shallows. Netting crews clubbed them and threw the bodies back, or left them stacked on the riverbank to rot in the sun. Old photographs show men grinning next to piles of them, 8-foot giants laid out in the mud like firewood, killed for the simple crime of being large, strange, and inconvenient. There were even organized campaigns to wipe them out entirely, built on the belief that clearing the gar would leave more room for the fish people actually want to catch. A living relic older than the dinosaurs was being treated like a weed to be pulled. Killing them outright was only half of it. The quieter destruction happened to the places they needed to survive. Alligator gar don't spawn in deep river channels. They need the shallow, flooded backwaters of spring, the moment when a river spills over its banks and drowns a low grass, giving young fish a soft, sheltered nursery before the water pulls back. No flood, no nursery. No nursery, no next generation. And for a century, we engineered the flood out of these rivers on purpose. Levees rose along every bank. Dams chopped free-flowing rivers into steady, managed pools. It worked exactly as intended. It kept water off the land we claimed, and in working, it quietly slammed the door on the one thing this fish needed to keep existing. It wasn't just being shot. It was being locked out of survival itself. The last confirmed wild alligator gar ever pulled from Illinois waters came up in 1966. After that, nothing. Year after year, the nets came up empty of them. And in 1994, the state made it official. Extinct. Gone from an entire state by rifle, by net, by levee, and by contempt. So there's your answer for why the monster wasn't already in the river when the carp arrived. We had already killed it, decades before the invasion ever began. There's a bitter kind of symmetry in that, if you let yourself sit with it. The river lost its guardian, and years later, something walked straight to the open door that guardian had once stood in front of. But this part of the story turns, because it isn't only a story about loss. By the late 1990s, something had shifted in how biologists thought about this fish. The old contempt gave way to something closer to grief and responsibility, the recognition that this animal had been a native piece of the river, ripped out by human hands, and that maybe with patience and hatchery work, it could be given back. Federal and state programs began carefully breeding alligator gar in captivity, coaxing this ancient, difficult species to reproduce under human care, raising young fish to be released back into rivers that had forgotten them. Illinois joined the effort, and in 2010, for the first time in more than 4 decades, young alligator gar slipped back into Illinois waters, small, armored, blinking into a current their ancestors had once ruled. On its own, it was a genuinely moving thing, a wrong, slowly being undone. But the timing was almost cruel in how perfectly it lined up. The gar was coming home into a river that was, at that exact moment, drowning in Asian carp. And the instant those two facts sat together in the public imagination, ancient native predator, invasive plague, the story wrote itself before anyone could stop it. This wasn't a quiet conservation win anymore. It became something far more thrilling, a monster returning to save the river. And once a story like that catches fire, it doesn't stay contained to river towns and fishing crews. It climbs, and it climbed all the way to the people who write the laws. In 2016, Illinois lawmakers folded the idea into official language, describing the alligator gar as the one native fish large enough to take down an adult Asian carp. It was a kind of solution everyone wanted to be true. No billion-dollar wall, no endless electricity, just an ancient predator doing what it was born to do. Everyone had their answer. Everyone was satisfied, except a small number of people who actually knew this fish, the biologists who raised it, The crews who carried the buckets to the riverbank, the people who understood, in a way no headline ever could, exactly what this animal could and could not do, and what they knew was deeply inconvenient. The people who actually ran the reintroduction program said it plainly, over and over, to anyone who would listen. The stockings had nothing to do with Asian carp. Nothing. The mission had always been simpler and far less cinematic than the story people wanted. Restore a native species of human beings at a race. Give anglers a genuine giant to encounter again. The carp were never part of the plan. And the numbers made that painfully clear. Between 2010 and 2013, roughly 6,000 young gar were released into Illinois waters. Of those 6,000, only around 1,500 survived. 1,500 fish against an invasion measured not in individuals but in tons per river mile. It wasn't a rescue. It was a gesture, a hopeful, sincere, biologically real gesture that could never move a number that size. And then there was a detail that quietly dismantled the entire monster story on its own. A gar's mouth only opened so wide. For the first few months of its life, a young silver carp is small enough to fit inside it. After that, the carp simply outgrows the gar's jaw. An adult gar could cruise right past an adult carp, the very fish the whole state imagined devouring, and do absolutely nothing, because it physically could not. The predator on the poster could not eat the villain on the poster. But a boring truth never beats a good monster story, and this one refused to die. It spread nationwide, and the public locked onto it, and would not let go, no matter how many times the people who actually knew better tried to correct it. Here is the part that makes this whole thing genuinely strange. The carp near Starved Rock really were disappearing. Year after year, the numbers really were coming down. The thing everyone was celebrating was real. It just had nothing at all, to do with the ancient fish on the posters. Something else was pushing the carp back. So if not the monster, then what? The first force was human, and it was relentless. Illinois hired commercial crews and paid them by the pound, with a bonus on top, and those crews went to war on the river. Over roughly 15 years, they pulled close to 50 million pounds of carp out of the Illinois River alone, and nearly 80 million statewide. They borrowed a Chinese harvesting technique that herds fish with underwater noise into shrinking pens of netting until there's nowhere left to swim. One single operation hauled up 750,000 pounds in a single sweep. They even bolted radio transmitters onto captured carp, Judas fish, and set them loose to betray their own schools, leading crews straight to the heart of the invasion. In 2022, the state spent roughly $600,000 rebranding the fish entirely, renaming it Kopi, short for copious, putting it on restaurant menus and dinner plates. Within 2 months of that campaign launching, removals topped 10 million pounds. The second force wasn't fish, and it wasn't fishermen. It was Chicago's own filthy water. As the carp pushed north toward the electric barrier, they ran into a stretch of river running through decades of industrial pollution, and something in that water stopped them cold. A university test dropped young silver carp into water drawn straight from that polluted stretch, and the fish went sluggish almost instantly. Simply surviving that water cost them more energy than they had to spare. So the carp, in large numbers, chose not to go. Concrete banks with nowhere to spawn, locks and dams breaking the river into disconnected pieces, relentless netting downstream. All of it, together, ground the invasion to stall. What held the line wasn't a monster with teeth. It was paid labor, a marketing campaign, and dirty water. And that kind of line only holds as long as somebody keeps paying to maintain it. Which brings us to the detail that should sharpen everything you've just heard. The carp front has held at that 50-mile mark for years, and only a small handful of individual fish have ever slipped past it. One in 2010, one in 2017, one in 2022. Every single time, crews caught that fish within 7 to 9 miles of Lake Michigan, cut it open, and searched for any sign of a spawning population behind it. Every single time, they found nothing. Just one desperate traveler that made it through the entire gauntlet and died alone before it could ever turn one fish into a million. Let that sit with you, because it tells you exactly how thin this margin really is. The lower Illinois River still belongs to the carp completely. Down there, a single female is still dropping over 1 million eggs every season, and that machine has never once slowed down. The only reason the top of the river stays clean is that people keep choosing to pay for it. Diners keep ordering Kopi-off menus. Chicago keeps flushing pollution into the water below, an unlikely and uncomfortable ally. Pull any one of those props away, and the wall gets shorter immediately. And this is where the story turns uncomfortable rather than triumphant. The permanent barrier project near Joliet, the one meant to lock this win in for good, stalled after a 2024 funding deal fell through. Even grants supporting commercial fishing crews doing the actual, unglamorous work of pulling carp out of the water got frozen. Meanwhile, hatchery trucks keep quietly backing up to the riverbank, releasing young alligator gar generation after generation, an ancient giant coming home. Still not the reason any of this worked, but coming home all the same, while the fight that's actually holding the line runs on a budget nobody can guarantee. So here is a question worth sitting with. The gar keeps coming back to this river regardless, a native species restored for its own sake, even though it never lifted a fin to save it. Somewhere else, quietly, unglamorously, human effort and industrial runoff are doing the actual work of holding an invasion at bay, for now. If the funding stops, if the nets stop, if the pollution ever clears up before the barrier is finished, does that line still hold? Or does the river the carp once owned outright finally take itself back?